Joining us now on the Picks for Pros podcast, he's coming to us from the West Coast as we continue our summer scouting series. We've got Erik Skopil in the house. He's the Oregon Ducks reporter for Duck Territory on 247 Sports. Check him out on X at Erik_Skopil. Let's get into it. How's it going today? Thanks so much for hopping on here.
Oh, this is really fun. I'm excited. I love talking draft, and the Ducks have some good players, so this should be fun.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because the Bears over the last few years have kind of gone to Oregon and basically said, like, hey, we are going to have a presence here. I mean, they drafted Thomas Graham Jr. 1 year back in, I think, 2021. You had Noah Sewell, who was on the roster for a couple of years, and was, I think, a 5th or 6th round pick of the Bears back in 2023. And then obviously, when Bo Nix's pro day was going on, it was actually quite hilarious because a lot of Bears fans were really freaking out because they're like, oh my God, they're going to make Bo Nix the number 1 overall pick. But I think, what the Bears were going to do with the 1st overall pick was without a doubt the worst kept secret in the league. But let's just go ahead and get right into it. Speaking on the topic of Noah Sewell, again, he's going into year 2 here in Chicago. I'm sure you had a chance to see him up front. What do you know about him? I mean, as a person and as a player.
Well, Noah hated doing interviews. That's the first thing that pops up. I think he basically did 2 maybe during his final 2 years at Oregon, and it was exciting when he would actually come over. And then he was not the most talkative, but I know he was beloved by his teammates and certainly left a strong impression. I think he had a really interesting career. Obviously, his brother Panay, very successful NFL player, very successful college player. One of Oregon's, I'd say, on the Mount Rushmore of offensive linemen the school's produced, one of the top guys that they had. And so when Noah arrived, they were supposed to have an overlap year. It was that 2020 year. Panay decided to sit it out, so they didn't get to play together. But I think that having the Sewell family together, at Oregon, or having at least 2 of them, because there's a bunch of brothers, they I think are kind of a legacy family and mean a lot to the program. And Noah I would say, played his best football as a sophomore for the Ducks. And then, unfortunately, I think his junior year, his final year, dealt with some injuries, and I just don't think played 100%. It was first year, I think, in the Dan Lanning system. And stylistically, maybe it didn't fit in terms of what they wanted to do with kind of that Mike linebacker position. So I don't think he was sent off with kind of the same I don't think his final season kind of lived up to what people had expected or hoped for, maybe, but certainly just top to bottom, somebody that I think the fans love and want to support and are hoping for big things this year. I'm curious to see what his role is going to look like, actually.
I mean, it's certainly going to be interesting because there were points last year during mandatory minicamp where he was actually generating a lot of buzz. But, you mentioned Dan Lanning and, you look at Will Stein. I mean, age-wise, you've got Dan Lanning, who I think is 38 or 39. You've got Will Stein, who's 34, Compared to a lot of, other college football head coaches, you could say that this is a very young, head coach / offensive coordinator duo. What's in store for them, as Oregon makes the jump to the Big Ten, because there seems to be massive expectations surrounding them. But I also know that last year at one point, Dan Lanning, for one of his speeches, ended up going viral at the start of the season.
Yeah. It's a really young staff. It's not just those 2. I think there are 5 or 6 of the 10 assistant coaches under 35, 2 under 30. I think Dan's idea when he came to Oregon was to kind of create a youthful coaching movement and kind of be, a location for some of these young minds to kind of work together and then kind of go off and do big things. I mean, the first offensive coordinator you mentioned, Will Stein, was actually Kenny Dillingham, who was, I think, 32 at Oregon for the 1 year, and then he got the Arizona State job the following year. So I think the goal is just to keep kind of churning out young coaching talent, just like he's churning out NFL caliber players. So Dan is fiery. He's, I think, very media savvy. I spoke about Noah not liking to doing interview. Dan does not like doing interviews either. So, the relationship with the journalists and the coach is kind of can be a little bit choppy at times, but I think overall, what Dan does really well is connect with his players and his guys. And he's a really smart young coach. He's super committed to the craft. I think, that Oregon's had several head coaches come in here since Chip Kelly, and this feels like the first one that kind of feels like they want to be here for the long haul, which is exciting for the fan base, just because they lost Willie Taggart after 1 year. They lost Mario Cristobal after 4. And Dan's only going into year 2, but he's already kind of had opportunities at Texas A&M or with Alabama in the last calendar year where he's made the decision to stick it out. So I think there's a lot of optimism. He's obviously a really good recruiter. That was something that he brought from his time at Georgia. And the roster, as I'm sure we'll get to, features, I think, just a lot more NFL talent than Oregon has ever had. I would argue top to bottom, this is the deepest and probably most talented roster that Oregon has had. That doesn't mean they'll have the best season, because there have been some teams that have played for national championships, and that's just really hard to do. But I think there's a reason that you look at like the power rankings of the best college football teams in the country, that Oregon's near the top. And I think Lanning and his ability to build a roster and to acquire talent through the portal and prep recruiting is really impressive. And there's a ton of financial support, which at this point also I think differentiates Oregon from other schools, just because of the connections with Nike and other donor bases.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely very interesting to see what he's building, because, he is making the kind of, from what it seems like from an outsider perspective, like you mentioned, he does want to be there for the long haul. But, you talk about the conference realignment, right? You talk about Oregon now coming into the Big Ten. What's the buzz in Eugene around making the jump into a bigger conference, knowing that, your schedule is going to include teams like Wisconsin and Michigan, Ohio State, I know is on there at some point, as is, a school such as Illinois.
Yeah, no, Ohio State, Michigan, and Wisconsin are all on the schedule this year. 2 of those are trips out. Ohio State's coming to Eugene, which I think is like the first time in, I want to say, close to 40 years that's been the case. They've played a couple times on neutral sites. Obviously, they played in Columbus in 21. Oregon had the very surprising upset there. But there's a lot of buzz just about the opportunity. I think the Ohio State game is probably going to be the toughest ticket to ever get at Autzen Stadium, if I'm honest, and like one of the most anticipated games. So just like you said, from like a expectation and anticipation perspective, I think it's pretty exciting. And I think Oregon fans are pretty jacked up and excited, because this does feel, as I said, and you look at the power rankings, this is, I don't think, just kind of lofty expectations locally. I think they're nationally seen as one of the, 2 to 4 or 5 best teams in the country this year. And that's a place that you want to be when you're entering a conference with the likes of Michigan, who just won a national championship, of Washington, who just played for a national championship, of Ohio State, who's always playing for them, of Penn State and Wisconsin, who are kind of, and Iowa, who are kind of battling for it. And you mentioned Illinois. I mean, there's a lot of good programs in this conference. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how adaptable Oregon's style of play is to this new conference. I actually think defensively they're built really well to compete with a lot of the offenses, just kind of doing a preliminary look around the conference and the talent and the way these teams are built. But there's a lot of optimism, a lot of excitement, I think, to join the Big Ten. There's also, I think, kind of a bittersweet nature, just because they've been in the same conference with a lot of these West Coast schools for a long time. And obviously, with the exception of 3 of them, they won't be playing them regularly. Oregon State, I think they'll try to maintain a pretty regular, maybe an annual, head-to-head. But it's a big change. I think it's a change that gets people excited. And ultimately, I think it gives Oregon a much better chance to achieve what it's always wanted to, which is to win a national championship.
It definitely is going to be interesting to watch, because I was going through the, college football week by week schedule, and I kind of highlighted, I'm like, okay, these are the weeks that I'm going to focus on these games. And there's a lot of Oregon games there, but it's also because it's kind of, I'm in the Midwest, so it's prime Big Ten country. But speaking of the offense, there's a bit of a change at the most important position in sports for the Ducks. You get Bo Nix going to the NFL, being drafted by the Denver Broncos. All of a sudden, because we're in the world of the transfer portal, you get Gabriel Dillon coming in. And again, he's played, solid college football at UCF. I think he was at Oklahoma as well. But now he goes into year 6, his first year in Eugene. I mean, what's the buzz around him? What did he show in the spring game? Because there's a lot of evaluators out there that are looking at him and saying, okay, we know for a fact that the upcoming quarterback class has its question marks. We know that there's some guys in there that are going to be surefire first round picks, but there's also those, type of prospects like Dylan who can kind of have one really good year and then rise to the top.
Well, I think the first line is he's super experienced, and you said it going into year 6. Bo Nix last year, cumulatively with the stops at Oregon and Auburn, set the NCAA record for most starts for a quarterback. I think it's 61, and Dylan's already made, I think, 53 or 54 starts. He's going to probably break that record. So this is someone who comes in with a lot of experience, 2 different stops, UCF, Oklahoma, had 10-win seasons at both places, had a lot of success. I like to look at just baseline. If you're looking at counting stats, the touchdown to interception rate is really strong, doesn't turn the ball over, a pretty accurate passer. I think there are some similarities to he and Bo Nix just in terms of how they succeed. I'm not saying that they're physically similar necessarily, or that they have similar arm talent, but Dylan is very agile, he's very accurate, and he's a good decision maker. And those are the things Bo was that allowed him to go from being, I think, kind of a disappointment at times at Auburn to being a quarterback who threw for 45 touchdowns and 3 interceptions last year. So, I was just making some kind of on-site predictions for the season, and I think Dylan Gabriel could throw for 4,000 yards this year. I think the offense is talented enough. I think Oregon's team is good enough to play enough games or something like that could happen. I think he's a really good fit for what Will Stein wants to do. As a draft prospect, I'll be interested because he's very short compared to the conventional quarterback. I think he's going to be listed at maybe 5'11" or 6 feet, but just standing around him, I think that might be a bit of a stretch. He's broadly built, though. This isn't like a Bryce Young with the narrow frame. He's sturdy. He's got big legs, broad shoulders. He's well put together for, obviously, he's an older quarterback. So, there's some physical limitations there. Maybe he's a lefty, which is a first for Oregon in a long time. But he does have, I think he has a strong arm. And I think the spring game showed a couple of things in that he trusts his arm to throw it deep, had kind of inconsistent success getting the ball to the receiver, but certainly wasn't afraid to push it downfield and showed really good zip on kind of the short intermediate stuff, which is obviously pretty important in the offense Oregon plays.
I mean, he is going to be one of those guys to watch, but beyond just him, who are some of the top names to know that could possibly be heading into their final season in college and that could look to make the jump to the NFL next year? Because, I look at the Ducks roster and I kind of say, okay, you've got guys like offensive tackle Josh Carnley Jr. You have Evan Stewart, who, again, comes in from Texas A&M. Jamari Caldwell and Jabbar Muhammad are a couple names to watch, but who are some of the top names to kind of go ahead and watch?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch that I think are draftable. Oregon just set a program record last year with, I think it was 7 or 8 players drafted. I think it'll be more this year. I think it's hard to see a situation where it isn't, and that includes kind of uncertainty about what Dylan Gabriel is. I wouldn't be surprised if Dylan Gabriel is undrafted, and I wouldn't be surprised if he has a great season and plays himself into like a 3rd or 5th round pick, just because there's enough tape on him to know that you're getting a reliable option there. So, but I think running back Jordan James will be draft eligible. I think he has really good physical traits to be an NFL player. Runs with great pad level, great balance, great vision. He's already kind of proven himself as a secondary runner. He'll be probably the primary guy this year. You mentioned Evan Stewart. I haven't seen a ton of him, but what I have seen has been impressive. He made some he's a really good route runner. He made some guys look really silly. Some players who I'll probably mention in a moment who are probably NFL caliber corners made him look real silly in the spring game. Tez Johnson, I think, is a name to know. That's Bo Nix's adopted brother. He and Bo had one of, I think Tez kind of gets overlooked because Troy Franklin had a great year, but Tez was awfully good himself last year. He had like 82 catches, 1,100 yards, and 10 touchdowns. This is a guy who I think has a chance to replicate that, assuming his chemistry is good enough with Gabriel. Terrence Ferguson's a tight end who probably had an opportunity to be taken in the middle rounds last year. He came back. I think he's got the size and physical tools to be an NFL guy. You mentioned Josh Connerly, the other tackle, Johnny Cornelius. I think both those guys are physically capable of being day 2, maybe NFL players in terms of the drafts. Defensively, you mentioned Jamari Caldwell. Jordan Birch, to me, is probably the best defensive player on the team. I think he has a chance to be special. He was a 5-star recruit, formerly at South Carolina. Had a pretty up and down season, but finished last year really, really strong. I think he had like 27 pressures over the last 4 games. So this is a guy who can get to the quarterback at 6'6", close to 300 pounds. You mentioned Jabbar Muhammad, I think, is someone I'm really excited to watch. This guy can be a lockdown. He, I think, led the country in pass breakups last year at Washington. Oregon fans didn't like him before because he was a big part of the reason the Huskies beat them twice, but now he's on their side. So, and I'll just throw out Jeffrey Bassa at linebacker. Linebacker is hard to project sometimes, but he kind of fits the physical traits of the guys that you're seeing being taken early-ish at that position at 6'2", 230, converted defensive back who I bet you will run sub 4.5 in the 40.
Yeah, I mean, all those are really intriguing names. You know, like I was going through the roster this morning and I was like, okay, you know, just from a, I guess, measurables perspective, there are a lot of guys that, you know, certainly do get you excited, especially with the way that the league is going. You know, there's a lot of, you know, hybrid players, a lot of versatile players as well. But, you know, to me, focusing in on the Bears here, because we know that they've got Montez Sweat, but we also know that this is a team that's got 3 picks inside the first 2 rounds next year, and that they do need another pass rusher. They could look to add another pass rusher, but, you know, why do you think a player like Jabbar Muhammad would make so much sense? Because to me, he would basically be the first Oregon player or Oregon pass rusher drafted in the first round since Kayvon Thibodeau.
Muhammad plays corner. Jordan Birch plays edge. Is that who we're talking about?
Oh, yeah. Well, no, sorry. I meant to say Jamari Caldwell. That's my bad.
You're good. Jamari is really interesting. I think he's like probably because Oregon is this stupid thing where they don't release heights and weights, so we don't know how big these guys really are. At Houston, I think he was listed at like 6'2", 305. I think he'll tell you he's 6'4". Standing next to him, I'm 6'2". I think we're about the same height, so I'm guessing that's probably closer to what he is. I've heard the term before, and I'll steal it. He's like a dancing bear. He's like a big guy who's really explosive and can really move his feet quickly. Great first step, strong hands. He did a couple of spring practice reps. We get to watch very little practice, but probably one of the more impressive reps all spring was his, where he got underneath the guy's pads and just lifted him and dropped him over. Kind of dropped him over. So strong, good base. I think Caldwell's interesting just because this is a guy who wasn't playing football like 2 years ago. He actually, I think, gave up the sport for a bit, was kind of unsatisfied for the direction it was going, and started to work, like as a Amazon employee, I think, for like a year. And then he kind of linked back up with a former junior college coach and worked himself to a place where he has an opportunity to be maybe a first or second round pick. Versatility, I think, he's played primarily defensive tackle, a little defensive end. They're going to try to play him a little at nose this year, is what they're saying. So, yeah, he's a fascinating player. I'd be curious to see kind of where he fits positionally at the next level, because he does have a lot of size.
Yeah, I mean, and when you get a defensive lineman that's got tons of size, I think that, versatility is certainly something that kind of comes to mind, because you can have those guys that align in a different number of fronts, or even, go from playing, defensive end all the way to kicking inside to playing defensive tackle. But last one from me here, and then we'll get you out of here. So what, in your opinion, because there's different levels of success and every single program has a different way to kind of measure success, but going into year 2 of the Dan Lanning era, knowing that there are a lot of future NFL stars on the roster, what do you think is going to define a successful season for the Ducks in 2024?
The fan expectations are always really high. I think entering a new conference makes it kind of difficult to assess what's fair or not. But when you start kind of an offseason as one of the 3 or 4 best teams in the country based on these rankings, I think, what was it, the FPI, ESPN's metric, has them as second best team in the country or something like that. That inflates expectations to a place that's probably unhealthy, just because you're entering a conference with the defending national champion in Michigan and with Ohio State, which also has a ton of talent. I think for a lot of Oregon fans, it's college football playoff or bust. With the expanded playoff with 12 teams this year, I think that's far more manageable. And And I think that's probably fair. I think if they're not a top 12 team, it's probably a disappointment. It's probably a surprise. I think the schedule, the way it breaks down, there's two really tough games and then a third pretty tough game at Wisconsin. I think you figure if you can win two of those three games, you're probably playing for a Big Ten championship. If you win all of those games, you certainly are, and you might be one of the top seeds going into this thing. So there are fans who think it's national championship or bust because this is such a talented roster. They're probably ignoring how good Ohio State, Georgia, and Texas, and Michigan, and some of the other schools are. But no, I think making the playoff is sort of where everybody thinks this season is headed. And shoot, they might maybe it's a breakthrough year and they make it back to a national championship game. But it's just hard to say that should be the expectation going into a season, given this is a totally new set of circumstances with a ton of different programs that they've like historically not faced.
Yeah, I mean, I will be honest. It's a very long season, so certainly anything can happen. But if you're if you're an Oregon fan listening to this thing, then you kind of want to, sort of temper your expectations, because while it is great to think national championship, there's also the big point that needs to be made, which is the fact that Ohio State, Georgia, Michigan, all these other big schools have just as talented of a roster as the Ducks do. But, where can people follow you on Twitter and keep up with your work?
Yeah, you can follow me. Are we calling it Twitter X? I don't know. Erik _Skopil. That's ERIK, last name SKOPIL. I think you can see it on the video here. My work at duckterritory.com. I also host a podcast called the Odds and Audibles podcast with a couple of my buddies, Matt Preem and Jared Mack, who works with the site. So, we're excited to get going with this. I'll be out at Big Ten Media Day in late July for my first kind of Big Ten experience. So I'm excited just to kind of get this whole experience going. It'll definitely be a shift from much longer flights, I'll put it that way, and more expensive flights, which means a different travel budget and a different approach to covering the teams. But yeah, you can follow me at those places.
Yeah, and it is definitely going to be interesting. If I end up at Big Ten Media Day, I'm probably going to end up driving down, seeing as it's only like a couple hours from me. But, we will kind of see how that pans out. Thanks so much for hopping on the show.